So again, thank you all for joining us and putting up with technical difficulties, the joys of live streaming, and thinking that we can have all this stuff working. It always seems to be about 10% of the time we seem to have some kind of technical glitch and technical problem. There's just always something in the live streaming world. So again, I'm Troy. I'm your host for these weekly chats. We're welcoming Ryan Waller here today. Ryan works with us at CG Spectrum, but he's also my partner in another company called Forthright Entertainment, which is a game publishing company. And Ryan can tell you a bit more about that here in a minute, and why he's qualified, sort of, kind of, to be here with us today as another industry vet. But I thought it would be great for you guys to have a perspective today. In my background, in my world, as many of you know, I'm a game designer, but I've spent about half of my career at game publishers. So I've worked, at Microsoft, at EA, Brash Entertainment, Disney, lots of small companies doing on the publishing side, and the development side of kind of being a publisher there. And so my experience has been predominantly in AAA, big, PC console kind of publishing. I have been somewhat involved with Forthright Entertainment and some other companies in doing some small amount of mobile and small amount of indie publishing, but really not that much per se. Whereas Ryan really has been an expert in the world of indie, the kind of this A to AAA kind of game world. And so feel free to ask us questions about both spectrums, about both sides of kind of the world of we're going to talk about what a publisher is and all that kind of stuff today, and just kind of all sides of sort of just what game publishing is all about. So please ask us questions. We're going to talk about kind of just sort of whatever we can about game publishing to answer all your questions and why it's important or not important, and everything else in between. So before we get started, Ryan, please tell us about yourself and tell us a little bit about Forthright and just kind of, those types of things.
So I started Forthright about 15 years ago now, I guess. Is that right? 13, 14 years ago. 2006. And it kind of evolved into becoming a mobile. So we really made our space in the mobile game space initially. I affectionately say that we kind of broke the App Store. We were one of the first, not the first, but one of the more successful early groups at licensing source code. So creating a mobile game, getting it, marketing it, and then licensing that source code so people can do what's called reskinning it. So that's kind of where we got started, moved into more core gaming about 7 or 8 years ago with some PC stuff. I've been involved in some other projects behind the scenes as an investor. So really kind of moved into the mobile space. I brought on my co-founder, Ken Rossman. Troy Dunaway, of course, joined us too. And we just kind of started growing into a more traditional, what they could say is a boutique publisher, right? So we target products anywhere from that $250,000 price point up to $2 million. So that's kind of the space that we operate as a publisher in. We focus mainly on PC console. We do have relationships and partnerships for mobile, but that's kind of where we did our focus. So that's kind of where I guess I built cut my teeth, as I guess the saying goes. So that's just a quick background on me. And then I've been doing game in some capacity for my whole life. I used to run a bulletin board system. I don't know if you guys know what bulletin board systems are, but in the early 90s, I had a very successful bulletin board system called the Round Table. And I was making almost $1,000 a month as a kid running a bulletin board, a Tri-BBS bulletin board system, where people would connect via dial-in modems and play games and stuff. So been around that space for a while. Worked in the music business, had a music management firm. So kind of been all over. I've been in the entertainment industry collectively for a while. I've done some film and TV stuff as well. So it's just a quick note on me.
So today, while we're talking about game publishing, we're gonna dive a little bit deeper. I'd say or try to onto the business side of things and stuff. But to kind of bring this full circle, as this channel typically is a channel about game design, you'll see that I'm also trying to educate you guys as potential game designers or game developers in all these other kind of tangential areas that are related, whether you realize it or not, to being a game designer. And so I want you guys to sort of have some understanding and background of what game publishing is, and all the things that are related to that, because whether you realize it or not, whether you're wanting to become a game designer or working in games at all, the publishing side and kind of the sales and marketing side of how we get our products, how we get them made, and how we get them to market has everything to do with what we make and the decisions we make and the decisions we have to make, and stuff. And so if you don't see both sides, then quite often we try to work in these vacuums. We try to make these isolated decisions that we think are going to be successful. But when we actually go to realize that there's other people we have to work with, they're going to come in with a very different set of opinions, and then sometimes just completely, throw us off in another direction, or we'll never get funded, or we'll never, have any success because we're doing what we want. Whereas, in the reality for a lot of projects and many projects, we either need to have a publisher or we need to have, some channel to get our games out to market. And if we're not putting that thing out in the right way, we fail. Right. And so I want you guys to kind of understand that this is not just about, learning about game publishing just because it's interesting, but this is actually very critical to like our success. Right.
Well, and often as a game designer, what can happen is, especially if you're a smaller group and you get a publishing deal, we'll get into this later, they dictate your funds oftentimes. And so they can dictate your scope depending on the deal terms you create. And we'll get into this too, a distribution deal versus a publishing deal. But you need to understand how, at least the high level of how publishing works as a game designer. It really does benefit your craft.
Yeah, and whether you are, I would say, any aspect of just being in game development, the more that you understand what a game designer does and what a game publisher does and what each group does, it will help you really work better in that group and in that community, because games are always a team effort. I mean, very, very, very rarely is it a army of one that's making a game. And so it does happen. And Ryan and I have worked with a few of those lone wolves, and those are some nightmare stories for another day and a few drinks. But
yep.
So I'll apologize in advance. I threw together like the world's worst PowerPoint that's ever been presented.
This is a guideline of just topical conversation.
Yeah, so
don't even call it a PowerPoint. It's just a rough outline.
These were some topics, some things, so that Ryan and I didn't go completely off on tangents, because we could definitely be here till about 3 p.m. tomorrow still talking about all these subjects if you don't rein us in. So it's definitely a pretty big, massive topic. So Ryan, why don't you take a stab? I'll let you talk first. Again, this is just a very general set of talking points, but let's tell people, especially with Forthright and just in general, like, what is a game publisher? Like, what do they actually do?
Yeah, and this actually is a really important question, because there's a general answer, but then there's really about how each publisher functions differently. And so a game publisher, essentially their job is to help get your game to the masses. It's to get it to market. Now, that can be lots of ways. A game publisher can be a big group like EA or Activision. And to be fair, those AAA game publishers have evolved over the last 20 years. To really, they have their own in-house studios at this point, and they publish their own games. But there was a time where and EA still does this, I suppose, but where they would go and publish other people's games. But they would usually be higher budget. They would definitely have higher marketing budgets, because marketing the product is one of the key elements of the game publisher. An indie game publisher or a boutique game publisher is a game publisher that targets usually smaller projects or indie developers specifically. Like I said, AAA they're publishing games that are in the $20+ million to hundreds of $1 million range. So I think I'm trying to think of the lower scale side. Like Metro Exodus would be a AAA game that's on the lower scale above the budget, and then you have games like Grand Theft Auto, which are on the high end. Then you have what they actually target, the platforms they target. They may target mobile, they may target PC, or they may target game consoles. So you have where they distribute the actual product to. But I'm just kind of going through Troy's guideline here. We'll break down stuff in a minute. So a first-party product is a product that is wholly owned by the game publisher. So think Halo. Well, I guess that's actually not the case anymore, but
no, Halo's technically owned by Microsoft and developed by Microsoft because 343 is a fully internal studio now. So
yeah, it is now. That's right. I was thinking through that. So Halo is a first-party title. A third-party title would be something if they are bringing in a non-owned product, like I'm trying to think of the upcoming release schedule they have. What's the new one for the Xbox Live coming out?
Well, like a game like Horizon Zero Dawn or something that's
first party. That's first party for Sony.
No, because it's not an internal studio.
Oh, I thought it was.
No,
it's Guerrilla Games, isn't it?
Yeah,
you're right. I'm sorry. You're correct. So yeah.
Whereas
Horizon Zero Dawn.
In comparison, God of War, which is developed by Sony Santa Monica, that would be a first party title because that's actually an owned studio within a. And
just like Uncharted would be a first party because they own that group too.
Yeah.
And then technically there is, for lack of a better word, there is a second party, which is essentially as a independent development group takes a IP that is owned by a major group and they make it for Microsoft. Microsoft's the only group that is actively doing that.
Yeah, there were some titles that kind of like Ratchet and Clank when I worked on that at Sony was kind of considered second party. We were not technically owned by Sony, but they had like investment and they had, some say, and they actually owned the IP, if I remember right, and stuff like that. They considered us second party when I worked at Insomniac. So there is a lot of kind of ones that are in that kind of gray area.
No one really uses that term anymore.
No.
But if you're wondering why there's first and third and there's no second, that's kind of the reason for that. So anyway, game publishers, though, going back, their job is to connect your product and get your product into the market. And they can do that through a variety of ways, from traditional marketing spend, platform relationships, influencer relationships. There's a lot more game publishers today than there was 10 years ago. Now, a lot of those are smaller, or they're targeting smaller products. But when Troy got started in the industry a long time ago, there was not a lot of options for game publishing. You either released the game or you worked for somebody else. So that's kind of just the initial high level. Well,
and something also, Ryan, to remember, something that's changed a lot, I would say, in the last 5-ish years was that, especially on console, it was actually an absolute requirement that you had to be, you absolutely legally had to be a first or third party game. You had to go through an approved publisher, and an approved publisher for the hardware consoles, it cost millions and millions of dollars. You had to go through a lot of checks and balances and these kinds of things. It was actually a pretty hard process to become a publisher. So a normal developer, most normal developers couldn't afford or go through the process of becoming a publisher on console. Now those, go ahead, Ryan.
A key part of that too is that, especially 5 years ago or more, you had to have physical disc retail as well, right? You didn't really have digital-only distribution. And so that cost a lot of money. So the average studio could not afford to go because the way the deals work is I make 100,000 copies of this game. I send that out. And usually the way those deals work with Target, Walmart, Best Buy, GameStop is they send back what they don't sell and you eat that cost. So as a small studio, you can't afford to do that. You can't afford the runs. And so therefore, with the consoles, you had to have the ability to show the console manufacturers that you had the ability to distribute your game at retail. So that's another driving factor of that.
Yeah, and two factors in the last, or I'd say 3 factors probably in the last 5 years changed the publishing world. The first factor being digital distribution and a lot of stuff moving more and more and more. I don't know what the percentage is now, but I feel like it's like 80% digital now or something like that. There's a pretty significant amount of actual distribution is now just digital. So the need for manufacturing and that whole thing went away for a lot of people and a lot of regions. And so that changed things. The second thing that changed, to Ryan's point, which is also really messed with the industry a lot, was the way that we used to pre-sell from a publisher our titles. Is we would go out, kind of like a movie or others would do, is we would actually go out to, say, Walmart, even a year or two before we were going to release a game, and we'd say, hey, here's this great game, you're going to love it. How many do you want to buy? And they would pre-sign up and say, well, we're going to take 1 million copies, over 6 months. And you would go out and basically pre-sell a whole bunch of stuff. So before the game even came out, you were basically making money or had guarantees against those sales. And so it was a way to almost guarantee your success. So if you were going to output, say, $20 million to develop the game and $20 million to market the game, you could actually potentially have $20, $30, $40 million of pre-sales before you even launch the game. And so that reduced a lot of your publishing risk, and you kind of knew what people wanted to do. But, and then what would happen is, to Ryan's point, like Walmart or somebody would say, like, okay, day one, we want 100,000 copies, and that's going to go to our central warehouse, and then they'll distribute it out to their stuff. Well, they were buying these large groups of stuff, which was great for us on the publishing side, where we could manufacture, 5 million copies and know that 90% of those went out, and then we only had to warehouse and kind of hold a little bit that we knew we could then start distributing out as people needed to refill their orders. But the second technology that came along is called JIT, or just-in-time delivery. And just-in-time delivery basically changed everything there, because Walmart and people like that no longer wanted to buy 1 million copies. They were like, okay, this store's going to get 6, this store's getting 5, this week, and then next week we might want another 3, and they were buying them literally in dozens at a time, or hundreds or thousands at a time, not in the millions, and they were not pre-committing all that stuff. And so it freaked out a lot of publishers, because we didn't know how much people were really going to buy anymore. We had to take this huge risk up front about, like, how much do we manufacture. So then we'd manufacture at a smaller volume, and what that meant then is we were paying a higher cost to manufacture those things, both because the less you manufacture, the higher the cost is. And then the second thing that would happen is that, gosh, stupid. And then we didn't have to warehouse them and things like that, but it was still just a pain in the butt. And so there was a number of things like that. And then the third thing that really happened was that the indie market, and this idea of just indie-made games, I think, in general, and this idea that, like, kind of the smaller companies and smaller teams, could have success, also really came kind of to a head, where for a long time your big publishers probably didn't even acknowledge the existence of an indie developer, to be honest. Like, we were kind of like, you're either one of us and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, or you don't exist. And right. that world kind of changed. And so there became more acceptance and more understanding that we needed to, as publishers, also support a bunch of people that were these in-betweens. And that may not mean that they were totally indies. Microsoft and Sony and them still wanted to maintain some control, but they recognized that not everybody could spend, $10 or $100 million on a product and have it at the same level. And so they tried to make more availability for indies and things like that. So there was a bunch of factors there that really affected the publishing industry over the last 5 years.
Well, and two other factors to add to that point, Troy, is number one is the technology leaps in the software that people can do. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, if I wanted to make a game, I had to build my own engine. I had, I'm not using Unreal or Unity. I'm making my own. So that's extra cost. 15 years ago, what it took someone to make a model, people are doing now in weeks, right? With Substance Painter. And so the tool sets over time enabled smaller groups of people to make better quality products and larger products. You combine that with, there was about 10 years ago, you kind of started running into this whole, I blame the ability of online gaming. When game publishers no longer had to make sure their game was buttoned down before release, because when you had physical releases, before there was the internet to push an update out, if you had a bug that killed your game was done, right? So you had to make sure your game was totally ready to go to market. The larger guys, there are places like Ubisoft, I know, got hammered for this. They were basically releasing products way before they were ready, and then updating. We can update it when it comes out. what that did is enough of that happened from the majors where it gave rise to these quote unquote indie developers. Now, a lot of them weren't what I would say is a real indie. When you have 30 people on a product and you're making millions of dollars, I don't think you're an indie, but by definition, you still can be. And so over time, it created this hole in the marketplace where innovation happened, where maybe they weren't as beautiful graphically, but the gameplay was, they could take more risks than these bigger publishers could. So all of these things factored in to the changing of the guard per se. So I don't know, Troy, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, I think the one last thing that also changed is this idea of, I think it started with free-to-play games, I believe, and kind of migrated into all games. But this idea that that games as a service, first of all, is part of this equation. But the second part of this is this idea that you can launch a game before it's done. You can do these pre-release type games, whether we called it an alpha, an open beta, or whatever else. Early access, any of these kinds of things, right? And so, for better or for worse, whether these things are good or bad, the early access stuff within the games allowed a lot of developers to release a lot of not quite so ready stuff, but that also was an interesting shift in the dynamic of when things were kind of available and not, and so on and so forth. So that was another interesting change, both I guess free to play and that early access stuff, especially on Steam, did dramatically change how the publishing world worked. So Ryan, I pull up the next slide. I think what we haven't really dove into yet, and what I'd love to hear you take a stab at first, is just kind of, again, really deeply, like, what are the actual things? Now, this can vary from title to title to title, but let's talk about, just between the two of us, a blanket of what are all these things that, as a game developer, why do you need a publisher? Like, what can a publisher potentially do? And again, not every publisher does all of this, but let's just talk about, like, what does a publisher really do? What are those services that a publisher is doing that help most developers? And why would you want to work with a publisher?
Yeah, so, and this is actually, as an indie developer, this is a really important question to answer, because the answer may be you don't need a publisher or you don't want a publisher. But chances are you probably need one even if you think you don't. So what are the bundle of services that publishers offer? So first of all, the financials. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this here, but there's a distribution deal versus a publishing deal. A publishing deal tends to be where they come in and they finance the product. So it may be completion funds. It could be that they bring in, marketing funds on top of this. But so the financials of them providing some form of financial completion funding or full funding to the product. Then of course there's the sales. He says there's sales, marketing, distribution. So this is how they get it out to the market. Whether it's physical disc retail or digital, or maybe it's territorial regional. Maybe you find a publisher for Korea, Japan, and China, and you keep the rights for the North America, Western Europe. There's a lot of different regions to which your game is sold in. There's external partnerships. So, for example, maybe Red Bull, Razer, AMD. These groups do partnerships that help promote your product. So sometimes these publishers have relationships with groups that can get your product out to a larger audience.
And those would also be like the Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, all of your platform providers.
Platforms.
And then
I would consider that platform partnerships, yeah.
Yeah, and then all of the licensor type stuff, which we can talk about if we're doing licensed products as well. That's a whole another big nut of potential external relationships they help manage.
If this is your first product, I'm going to recommend you avoid a licensed product. That's just my opinion, but maybe not. But that's a whole other complication level. The other thing that really is what is bundled often as QA, right? Quality assurance. So the testing, the usability, compatibility on platforms. Does this work on Sony? Does this work, on a mobile device? So depending, again, not every publisher offers all of these services. They may specialize in certain elements of this. Some do offer all of this. And then if you're a small group, some groups like Forthright, we actually do this. Some of our people that we've targeted, we come in maybe if you're a developer, you just make games, right? But you don't understand the business side of it. So a publisher could come alongside you and teach you how to scale your company, how to create budgets, to make sure you're actually making profitability, keeping your people employed. So that's another side of that equation. And sometimes that could even be, they may make an equity stake. Some publishers actually do investment in studios on top of publishing. So there's a large variety. I think other services, localization, making sure that you're, sorry.
No, as I say, VO production that kind of goes with that. Like some of them handle a lot of audio, music, voiceover, a lot of the specialized stuff that a small team wouldn't have the in-house expertise or facilities to do. A lot of publishers, the publisher may not be either doing that in-house, but they were often responsible for it. Now, I don't know I haven't done a big AAA deal in the last 5 years, so I'm not 100% sure, but I know that like when I was at Brash, when I was at Microsoft, we were actually responsible for the financial side and the stuff of like all the music, all the audio, effects. We would basically create all that content and then hand it off to the developer just to implement. But we were actually the ones paying for it and kind of doing a lot of that type of stuff.
It all honestly depends on both every single publishing deal, even with same developer publisher, if they work on a second title. Every deal is its own beast. Every deal has its own dynamics. And so there is a guideline to what it operates at. Oftentimes, the do we actually have in the slide about the downside of publishers?
Yeah, we kind of talked about, there's the, what we're saying, we can go back, but yeah, this was
okay, good. Yeah, okay. So I'll just touch on this right here, which is oftentimes and traditionally, this is changing somewhat, but usually if you're saying I'm just going to throw out numbers. I need $1 million to make my game. All right, so we come to the Troy Dunaway company and we say, Troy, I need $1 million. And Troy's like, great, I believe in you. Let's do it. I own the IP and you guys can get 20% of the revenue. It's your idea. You have the whole thing, but I call this sharecropping model, right? That often does happen. There's also things with publishers in the sense of that can be waterfall deals that can turn the tides from their favor early, which they're taking the risk financially, so they get rewarded for that risk. But if you have a big successful title, then you can get rewarded on the back end. There's all kinds of structures to how that works. I personally think that the right good publishers, and there are good publishers out there, are worth their weight in gold, quite literally. They can get your product and make your product successful. Bad publishers will be a nightmare. And there's a lot of those too.
Yeah.
So do some due diligence. Sorry, I'm going to go back though to the services. I kind of got a little tangent there, but the biggest part in my mind though really is about, it's really that final polish. It's really that last presentation stage to the consumer, right? Like, let's get your localization. Let's make sure your UI and our testing, the testability, does this work well? Can we do, the larger publishers can do these market tests, internal testing to kind of see how the game's received. And again, nowadays there are organizations that serve indie developers that do some of these things individually, so you can partner and as an indie still do them. But again, it's really tough if you're the creative lead or the head of your studio and you're making a product. What ends up happening oftentimes is you are then pulled away from the actual game development and doing all these business things, because all of this stuff takes a ton of time, and usually it takes a ton of people. And so if you're trying to do all this as a developer on your own, it's going to pull you out of your product. And so this is really where, in my mind, these services can enable you as a game developer to focus on making a good product, lean on their expertise to make your product better, and then they can help with all the details that are important to the game that maybe aren't your area of expertise. Because you have a learning curve on top of that, you have to do it, is you're having to learn this stuff too. And that's also dangerous. It's a potentially a risk to your business, and it's just extra time on the consumption. So,
and Ryan, I mean, and what a lot of people don't understand, I mean, coming from having been a small developer for a lot of my career, we definitely, I think, especially in the early days, didn't understand the value of a publisher. Like, we had this arrogance of like, oh, well, we're the one making the game. We're doing all the work. We're taking all the risk. And then like, why are we getting 20%? You know, and it always felt imbalanced. But what we didn't see was quite often, like we had a producer, for example, or one or two executives from that publisher who we dealt with, right? So in our minds, we're 50, 70, 100 people in our team, and then we would just see one or two people on the publishing side, and kind of in our minds, we're just like, why are we paying all this money for these two guys to help us? What we didn't see was the fact that publisher had 200 people like actually working on our title, you know, between the testers, between the marketing teams, you know, and all these kinds of things. And so we're thinking like our little 50 people are important, and not realizing the publisher actually had just as many, if not 2 or 3 times as many people working, doing the, you know, helping us in ways that we just didn't even understand at all. And so there was this like disconnect in respect for each other, because we just didn't know and didn't realize that the publisher was doing so much work that we took for granted. And then, you know, ultimately it came out, they took a big chunk of money, and we're like this felt unfair to us. But in reality, they were actually doing a lot of work, spending millions of dollars and all this kinds of things. But we didn't see that a lot of times. It's very behind the scenes in a lot of regards.
Well, and the transition to now, some of this also is, and Troy, I know you've talked about this before. I know that at CG Spectrum and some of the courses in the game design course, you talk about networking and the importance of networking, right? One of the things that game publishers do is, to your point earlier about the external partnerships, or I would call platform partners, which I kind of put in my mind in their own group, which is Xbox, Sony, Nintendo, Apple, Google. If you're, let's just look at a mobile game. If you have this cool mobile game, right, and you release this mobile game, how many mobile games are on the Apple App Store right now?
Like 500 new games a day, I think.
I mean, there's so much, right? So here comes the Troy Dunaway mobile company and says, hey, Ryan, we really like your game. We want to publish this. Okay, well, we're going to give you 30% of the revenue. We're going to take 70. What? That sounds unfair. But here's what happens. They can guarantee you with their relationship with Apple that you're going to get front page placement in Apple, or, you know, feature in certain categories on Apple, multiple places, right? Well, depending on their relationship, that could be worth more than the 100% of my own revenue when I'm just going to be up for 2 weeks and then my game's gone, or my marketing doesn't.
Thanks, Mountain Man, for joining us. Sorry.
Yeah, hey, Mountain Man, sorry. Yeah, definitely have a safe day. Be safe, man. Appreciate you stopping by. My point in all that is saying is, just because you may not see, like to Troy's point, well, we're doing all the work, there's more. Game development isn't just the development side. It's how do you get it into the hands of consumers. And that can be worth a lot of money. The right publisher with the right connections can give your game such better presence. So, for example, at Forthright, we have really good relationships with Sony and Nintendo. We're able to do things oftentimes if we have a good product. They don't. We find good products where we can get better placement or even cross promotional work with them. And so those are things that matter. So we have a title right now that's coming out this year that we've signed partnerships with AMD and Red Bull for, and we're going to get a lot of marketing money out of those deals. But it also is going to be reciprocal. It's a good deal for those external partners as well. So I just say all to say is every single deal can have different benefits, and it's all about finding the right publisher for your product. You can also get a bad publisher or a bad fit. Maybe you guys think it goes well and there's tension and it just doesn't work well. But at the end of the day, the publisher brings value if in fact they can get the product into the hands of the consumers and do a better job than you can. And that's my opinion.
Yeah, and something to keep in mind is that, you know, I'd say one of the other shifts that's kind of happened over the years, especially in mobile, and we can tangent on mobile here in a second, and more specifics about this. But in general, it kind of used to be like when I was at Microsoft and stuff, we kind of had a bit of an attitude of like, if we just build a great game, the people will come buy it, right?
If you build it, they will come.
Yes, and that was kind of true, you know. And we did spend money, but on marketing and stuff, but it was a different kind of attitude. The development team never was really involved that much in the marketing. We were just kind of like, we'd build our game, somebody else would sell it, and they were two different worlds. And quite often the general rule of thumb that we had at a lot of my companies was, for every dollar spent in development was roughly how much we'd spend a dollar in marketing. So if a game was $1 million budget in development, we'd spend $1 million in marketing. Or if it's 10 million or 20 million to develop it, then we'd have a 10 or 20 million dollar marketing budget. Now, of course, that can drastically change, but that was kind of our starting point for where we'd start to negotiate a lot of our deals. So the marketing teams and the development teams were kind of equal, just in the sense the amount of money that they needed, and we had to have a great game and great marketing. They kind of went side by side. Nowadays, I'm finding that, especially in mobile, where you might start at 1-to-1, the reality is you probably need to spend about 10-to-1 or 5-to-1 in marketing and user acquisition compared to the development team. So while the development team still has this attitude of like, we're everything, we're the most important people in the world, the reality is your marketing team probably has 5 or 10x your budget and 5 or 10x harder job and more importance. And so now it's more important to make a good game with great, incredible marketing and UA than it is to make like an incredible game that's poorly marketed. And
in this point too, this is why mobile is so different than PC and console, because the UA cost in mobile is so competitive. It's so expensive, which is why if you're making a mobile game, getting a mobile partner and Forthright is not a mobile games publisher, so I'm saying this as this is not self-serving.
Well, thanks, Jono. Thanks have a great day too.
Hey, buddy. Yeah, man. Have a good one. Thanks for stopping by. It's so important to have someone that can get that user acquisition. And this is where most indie developers cannot afford a user acquisition cost. When we actually got out of the mobile space, it was in this transition period where I was paying 10 cents, 20 cents for user acquisition. Those in gaming can be as much as $10 and $20 per user acquisition now. So for qualified users, it's just those costs matter, but not just the cost. The right publisher knows how to identify and target those user acquisitions. So again, every deal is different.
Yeah, and on the mobile side, just to talk about mobile publishing right now, that is one of the messiest places I think that exists in our current marketplace, and something that scares the heck out of me and frustrates the heck out of me, at an incredible level, because the mobile publishers in general, is a generalization, and this is not 100% of them, but I would say 90-95% are completely, totally, absolutely risk adverse. They will not take any risk whatsoever. And so what that means is that in the console PC world, for a long time, most of your publishers, a lot of your projects, everything, as you've heard me talk about even last week, it's all about money in the end, right? The money, like how do you get a project started? Whether you're an indie or whether you're a AAA, you either have to have your own money, or a publisher quite often was the person who came in. Like when I was at Microsoft, we would have maybe 20% of our developers would come in with their own money, with their own prototypes, and they would build something, and we'd say, okay, that's great, we're going to sign it. But there was a lot of developers that were just what I'd call an on-paper idea. They just had a pitch deck, they had an idea, they might have had a reputation, or they had previous works or whatever, and so we would come up with some budget and give them a few $100,000 or whatever that was to go build a prototype. And then that prototype, we'd look at it and go like yes or no, or maybe change it some more, and we get it to where we want, and then we'd maybe sign the big deal. On the mobile side, the mobile publishers are like, screw that, we're not taking any risk whatsoever. And in fact, not only are we not going to fund a prototype, we're not even going to fund the development of the game at all. We're going to basically wait for you to finish the game. We want you to launch that game live, run it for like 3 to 6 months, see a bunch of successful KPIs. And if we see the game successful there, now we'll come in and give you some money for user acquisition, marketing, and help you grow it to something massive. But like whether you're an indie or a small company or whatever, how do you spend millions of dollars to get like to, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to get it there to even talk to a publisher? So most publishers on mobile side won't even open the door to you until you've been live for months. It's ridiculous.
So KPI, for those who don't know, is the key performance
indicator.
Oh,
yeah, sorry.
It basically what he's saying is we should release it, usually a limited release, right? So put it in 5 or 6 markets, and we want to see how it does in 5 or 6 markets. And if it does well, although to your point, right now I think they want to see you just release the whole game, and if it basically, oh look, it's taking off, it has a market, okay, then we'll help out. Like it's like the guy to give you an example. This would be like you saying, I want to go start a restaurant, and I need some money to do that. Well, I'm going to help you start the restaurant. You start the restaurant makes money, you start doing well, and then I come in and say, oh, well, I'll help fund your restaurant, and I'll help you get your restaurant to more customers. But you're already making money on your restaurant. You're already showing success at the restaurant. So and that simplifies it because they are able to scale it in such a way that in the sense of a restaurant couldn't. But the point is, to Troy's point, it's frustrating because back when Troy was when Troy was in the industry 20 years ago and I was in 15 years ago, you could pitch. They would fund prototypes. They would fund full sources from nothing. Like at his point, from as we say, on paper company, right? And no one does that. It just basically mobile publishers now are exclusively. There's too much competition you're up against. They don't have to sign you. They can find someone that already has a successful game and scale it. Right? That's the reality.
Yeah. And so it makes it really, really, really hard for most companies now, especially in the mobile space, to get out there to get noticed. And then it's weird too because the publishers will also take the risk that if you're super successful, then you'll never need them, right? So they can only find these middle ground products that are like, because if you completely fail, they don't want to talk to you. If you're marginally successful, but you need money to grow, that's like great for them. But if you're like, if you hit it out of the park, you're also like, forget you, I don't need your money either. So that like they can't even hit those big AAA like home run that are going to go 10x kind of things. And so it's weird, but they just the mobile publishers are just super risk adverse, and so mobile publishing is really its own deal. And that like I said, I would guess 90% of the mobile publishers are not doing all these things that we're talking about here. They're really all about user acquisition and growth.
Yeah. Well, and not faulting them for it, but that's just the way the market has evolved, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the other side of the mobile is that it is a constantly evolving market at a substantially faster pace than PC and console, which, by the way, are evolving at their own pretty light speed. So it's the mobile trends can change in 6 weeks to 8 weeks.
Yeah, and the other thing you guys have to be aware of too on the mobile side is that it's so much more competitive, and there's just so much more competition there and stuff that this idea of having somebody to help you, it's just like I said, it's a space that if you don't understand it, you don't know it, it'll just crush you. And a lot of people make the mistake that they can self-publish because there's nothing that stops you from doing that. To Apple and to Google or whoever, but keep in mind that's a risk. Also, as a quick aside that's related to that, because it's in the news now with Epic suing Apple and all these things. There's if you don't know and if you're not aware of, and I kind of talked about this last week, but on the business side of these things, remember that most of these hardware platforms are taking approximately 30% straight off the top. So your mobile guys for sure are doing it. Apple, Nintendo, Microsoft have their cuts. Steam's maybe a little bit less.
It's not unless you cross the $50 million mark, and then it goes to 20%, I think.
Yeah, so they'll have thresholds. I'm not trying to get into exact numbers because it changes by deal. But the point is that every one of these things, these distribution platforms, whether they own the hardware, like a gaming console or a mobile device, or whether they're a distribution platform like Steam, or even the Epic, has its own store now, or whatever it is, each one of those takes money right off the top. And for me as a developer, it's beyond frustrating because quite often in my development deals, I'm getting like sometimes 10, 12, maybe 20%. back end on a deal that I'm the one that put all the blood, sweat, tears, 2 years of my life, poured everything, money, everything into this thing for 2 years. And I might get 20% out of that if I'm lucky. And yet Apple and these other guys are taking 30 for, I can't say no work, but pretty darn little work, and so that's one of the reasons there's some clashing going on right now between Epic and others. And I think we haven't seen the end of it. I think we'll keep seeing this level of frustration. And it doesn't mean that those hardware companies don't deserve a cut, because they spent all the R&D money and marketing, and they made a product that ultimately is a closed platform. They do control it. So I'm not saying they don't own and deserve something, but
they're giving you the privilege. What you're really paying for, honestly, is the privilege to speak to their customers. That's essentially what it really is.
Yeah, and
it's not that simple, but I mean, it is that simple at one level.
Yeah. So I totally get, that they deserve something, but that's where I think the clash between developers and publishers, while many developers, we've been biting our tongue for years and just accepting it, it's kind of boiling to a head sometimes when you're like, why are these guys getting twice what I'm making, and I'm doing all the risk and I take all the work and things like that. So at some point, some equilibrium has to balance.
And there are publishers, at least in the PC console space, the model has changed. And let's go back. Let's talk actually about a distribution deal versus a publishing deal some more, Troy.
Yeah.
So a distribution deal is always more beneficial for a developer.
Why don't you explain what a distribution deal is versus a publishing deal?
Yeah. A distribution deal is, I have a completed product and I just need you to get this out. So what happens is, and to Troy's point about all the people that work at publishers, you have reduced the scope of who they're having to use their manpower on, right? So let's say, for example, that Troy has he has a great relationship with Sony and Steam, and I can get on either of those platforms, but Troy has the ability to say, hey, you know what? If you go with me, I'll give you 70% of the revenue, but I can guarantee you a really good marketing push on the Sony platform. Well, that's worth a lot of money to me, right? So I would do a distribution deal where he is distributing that to the Sony platform, maybe worldwide. There's also the retail side of this, but I'm not going to get into that. That's really where it initially came from. But a distribution deal at the end of the day is essentially the developer is not putting in completion funds to your title. They are leveraging their network, their relationship, their platform partners to get your product on the market quickly and with better exposure.
And actually, to be even clearer, there's two types of what we call distribution deals. So really a distribution deal, again, to Ryan's point, is I'm a developer. I'm lucky enough, whether that was through an investor or my own money, because my company had a previous product, whatever it is, I basically self-fund the development of the entire game. Now, when I go to distribute it, there's two levels. There's the distribution, like the just getting it to the market, and getting out, to retail stores, getting out there. But there's also the marketing side, the sales side. And so sometimes those get separated because
a marketing deal.
Because sometimes I have been at companies where we had enough money, we did the development ourselves, and we did our own marketing. But we had them do like a level of like what we call distribution, i.e. getting it out to, Walmart, getting it out to Electronics Boutique, getting out to the retail channels, doing things like that, getting out, and even working sometimes to the press. So you can divide that up a little bit more, and it really just depends on, it's all about money. Who puts in how much money, and therefore how much risk, and therefore the more, whoever basically puts the most risk in, i.e. the most money, gets the biggest return. And that's generally, as a blanket generalization, sort of how it would work.
And actually, some publishers, and I've actually seen these deals directly, they say, okay, well, we're going to put $1 million in this product, but we want to see $3 million back. So the deal can actually literally be, they're going to get $3 million, and then you get money. Like, that's not an uncommon process. So,
and in fact, some of them might want $6 million. They may give you $3 million and want $6 million back, and then after you've paid them $6 million, you'll start getting, say, some percentage. You may get a bunch back or not, but a lot of them will want even more, ROI. They want some return, even beyond their initial investment, and then they'll start splitting things with you or whatever. So some of these deals can really horrible for developers if you don't sell very well, and then they can be like become very lucrative if you believe in it and you know that you sell really well and you do sell really well, then that deal becomes much better for you long term. But if you fail, you're going to fail hard. You know.
Well, and there's other parts too here, and this is about talking about team guidance and company guidance. So there are some elements here where if you're a developer and you really want to you have this great idea and you know that this idea is going to cost you more money than you can deliver to make this idea, right? Say you have this idea called Halo, right? Like if you have this idea that you really want to get in the market, you may recognize and say, I'm going to do a deal with a publisher. I may not make that much money off this product or any money off this product, but if I get this product in the market, that will enable me or be easier for me to then go and raise money through an investor or get another publishing deal, right? So there's some strategies here as a developer too on what are you wanting to get out of the deal from the publisher, right? It may not just be strictly financial gain. It could be the notoriety. It could be, hey, we did a deal with Activision and Activision featured our company, right? So to help establish your brand, your own company. So there's different elements that you can want out of a publishing deal. Sorry, go ahead, Troy.
Yeah, and I'd say another aspect to this is the rights ownerships of the IP. Now, that idea, like to Ryan was saying, like you might come to a publisher and have the greatest idea ever, but if you don't have any money, that developer or that publisher may agree with you. They may go like, oh man, we love this idea and we're going to give you $10 million to go make it, but we actually going to own it. And in the end, they're going to try. They don't always get, but you have to be careful in your legal agreements because every publisher is going to try and own that IP because if it's really successful, if they own it outright, they literally could fire you, not even hire you to do the sequel and go take it internally or do something else. And they would make all the money off of it. Movie rights, TV rights, worldwide rights. They could literally take everything away from you if they own that IP. And so, or that IP could be owned by a movie studio or could be owned by somebody else. And then you got to pay them off too, which is even another chunk that goes away from you. So IP ownership is also another huge part of the financial side of these things, but it's also about the control. Ryan, we got two questions here. Let's answer those before we.
You take drawn, I'll take big.
Okay. So drawn, so the credit for creating a video game really in the end is the developer and the publisher together generally work on a credits list. And I've seen everything from, for example, like in Insomniac, we didn't credit specific people on a specific job role. We just basically said, here's everybody at Insomniac that worked on it. Here's everybody at Sony that worked on it. And it was just a list of names. And so the credit was, developed by, published by, and it was just vague. And then more like a movie, I would say the more often case is literally like, here's all these people with all these roles, and your credits list can be 1,000 people long sometimes, and some are at different companies. They could be outsourced companies, they could be publishers, they could be, localization QA. I mean, so there could literally be 5, 10, 20 companies involved in different aspects of the game. You could have had somebody porting it, you could have had, like all this stuff. So it's really the executives at the company who make the final decisions along with the publishers about whose name stays in there. That can be controversial sometimes. I've actually had some problems with some developers who were a little vindictive after I left the company when the game shipped, and they patched the game and took my name out of the credits. And that's been a problem. And so it's it can be real great.
So petty.
I was the project lead on a project, and literally like the project finished, I left the company. The original retail game shipped with my name in it. And then like 2 months later, I looked at the game and I was like, my name's not on it. And they had patched the game and taken my name out. Like,
that's so petty.
Yeah. Like just like, and I've heard that story a lot. Like that's not the first time that just things like that happen. Our industry is horribly, horribly bad about giving people, credit sometimes. And in fact, even being the project lead on some projects, like even I'll look at a credits list and I'm like, who the heck are all these people? And there's 100 people listed like that are executives at the company, and you're like, I mean, I've been on the project start to finish. I have never heard your name. Like, you know, and they're like, oh, well, we read some document sometime that, you know, whatever, and they put their name on it. So it can get pretty murky about who really takes full credit, you know, on stuff. But, you know, that's just, that's just part of the problem. And then I'll answer this real quick, Drawn Skull. So the creator of the IP, that's a vague statement. So the creator of an IP, right? I don't care whether you create Halo or whatever it is. Very, very rarely is the creator a person, right? The creator is generally a team. Now it might have been, you know, one person that originated that very, very first idea or something like that. But unless you like went and wrote a book about it or did something that was major, you're generally never going to get credited as the creator of the idea, like, or owning the IP, unless you were really savvy. Like, you know, if I was a creative director and came up with an idea and like patented it or protected it or was savvy legally and kind of put my name as the creator of it, that occasionally happens. I saw like American McGee, for example. If you don't know that American McGee is a guy's name, throws me off the first time because that is his legal name, American McGee. He was one of the original Quake designers, right? It was Quake or Doom? I can't remember. Anyways, he worked on. He was a level designer on one of the early games, and had a good reputation from that. And like he went on to work on a game called Alice. And yep. I don't know if that was the only one he put his name on, but it was literally like American McGee's Alice, right?
American McGee's Alice, yep.
Right, and so he literally got his name on the title like that. But like the number of people that have done that are in the not that many, you know, or whatever. So like you don't even like even John Romero for Doom or Quake or whatever. Like generally they're not getting the credit as the creator of the IP. They're one of the people that created it, but you have to you do have to try to protect yourselves. Again,
yeah, like Cliffy B is an example of someone that did do that well. Like.
Yeah, don't get me started on that one. But
so Big Glob, to answer the next question, are deals funding the carrot that publishers dangle to potentially influence the actual development of the game? So let me ask you a question. Are you saying that this is how they control the game? When you say influence the actual game development, that's
what I'm reading it as. But
that's what I thought too.
Big Glob, please clarify if we're not answering it the right way. But yes, I would assume that the money is one way they control you.
Yeah. So again, this all comes back to find the right partner, right? So for example, I'll just speak to Forthright. We're not looking to publish games that we have to handhold the development team. We want to find partners that know what they're building. And that we can come alongside and help them in a partnership model. Now we have a game under development right now that's a new team. Normally, as a developer, you don't really sign on a first game team. That's not normally from a risk aversion perspective. But these guys, we've been tracking them for 2 years. They've done a lot, so we are doing some company guidance with these guys. And we are helping them shape the game a little bit, but we're helping shape the game in the direction that they're wanting to go with it. So we know where they're wanting to go. They trust us. We trust them. And so it's a partnership model. There are scenarios where maybe you see a team that has this idea and they make this pitch to you. And you're like, wow, that's really good, but they're going the wrong direction with it. And so there are publishers that would come in and say, okay, we're gonna sign your game, Troy. $10 million, and then we're going to absolutely be so hands-on that you want to quit and you hate your life. That does happen too. So to answer your question, it can be the carrot. It isn't always the carrot.
I think that having been a publisher, you know, for again half of my career or so, and been at some of the biggest, you know, publishing companies, one of the things is you always go into a deal with the best intentions. You always go in thinking that you're both going to be best friends. It's this happy marriage. But just like any marriage, tensions start to brew, especially over money. Or, you know, what are you going to do and what color car do you want to buy, and all these other things start to become conflict as the nature. And then as the developer has problems and things start to turn, I don't know that I've ever been on a project that's been 100% smooth. Like there's just inevitably there's delays, there's schedule changes, and it's not even necessarily anybody's fault. It can be a wide variety of things of who's at fault. But I have definitely worked with some not so good developers. And most of those are out of business now. And in fact, some of the developers, I can tell you that the executives are in jail. It was so bad. And I'm not exaggerating. I've worked with developers that the senior executives ended up in jail, during the project, that they were doing some shady stuff. So, there is bad people out there. There is bad companies out there. Bad things have happened. Now, that being said, to your point, I have had to use the what we call milestone payments. So typically, if you guys don't know how a deal term is structured, typically with a developer and a publisher, at whatever point when a developer, let's say the publisher is going to fund the entire project, then usually you set up what's called milestones, and those milestones are typically every month. Usually every 4 weeks, but they could be every 8. It just depends. But most typically they're every 4 weeks. That developer is then responsible to make a build of the game. They have a schedule that they have to hit, and then every month they have to basically give me a build of the game. I have to look at that build, I play it, or it could even just be read the documents or whatever it is at that stage. But they've agreed to ahead of time what they're going to do each milestone and each month. If they hit that or are close enough, then I approve that, and then the finance department will write them a check, for their next month's of work. I have absolutely held that against developers who did not come anywhere close to meeting their milestones and were being difficult and being, antagonistic and wanting to take the game in a different direction and stuff like that. And I have refused payment of milestones and forced them to go do what I want, and I absolutely hate doing that. Like that's the worst. I mean, that's like, I don't know the best analogy there, but it's going to ruin the relationship, right? At that point, there's kind of no turning back. The relationship's now hostile, and it's just not going to be pretty. But when I'm investing $10-20 million into something and I see it going down the hole, like at some point, it's my responsibility, for my publisher to save the project. And if I've got to do something to save it, I got to do that, right? And so that's a challenge that you have to have. And so that carrot and that ability to pay them and them literally to pay payroll is hinged on me. And I have used that, as a way to force developers to do things. So again, not a good scenario to do, but it is done.
Yeah. So to answer, going back here to the issue with EA and DICE, that's a little different dynamic because DICE is an internal studio. So that's a disconnect within organization as a company. So EA can do whatever they want with DICE. It's theirs. That being said, the fact that the DICE leadership team was able to roll back all that microtransaction stuff in less than a week, it definitely tells you that the internal development team knew that the accounting team was driving the narration for that. And Battlefront 2 is a great game. It destroyed what that game could have been. Even though they fixed it and the game's good now, it really hurt it. So that's a little different than a publisher investing in a separate company.
But it's the same. I mean, it's the same general problem. I mean, I have, even like my cousin works for an internal studio or purchased, company that was recently purchased by one of the big guys. And it drives him crazy. He's in the art team, and that particular publisher is very, 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 very focused on art and the visual look, and they're just nitpicking every little tiny thing to make it look, as good as possible. Some publishers are more concerned about game design, and they will drive you towards a certain thing, and whether that's microtransactions because they think that's the way to monetize or whatever it is. There's always going to be conflict between developers and publishers, whether it's in art or design or whatever. And it's just a matter of can you sit down and have reasonable conversations and find a happy medium? Or is this thing dictated and you're just kind of like, nope, this is what you're doing. This is what you're going to, this is what, is going to happen. And whether you're internal or external, the same level of conflict happens. Like even another story, when I was at Midway, at Midway globally, at the time we were doing a Mortal Kombat fighting game, and we were an external studio that got purchased. So we had been just recently purchased within that year by Midway, and we had our own tech, our own engine, everything that was designed for fighting games. It worked perfectly for fighting games. It had no problems. But Midway decided at a global level that they were going to switch to the Unreal Engine. This was Unreal 3 at the time. And they switched all internal projects to Unreal and forced us to switch to Unreal when we already had existing tech. We were 6 months into the project. And we had to do a massive change to a whole other engine, which we didn't know, which didn't work for fighting games, and all these kinds of things, and talk about massive conflict. I mean, and problems and costs and fighting and everything else. It just about killed us. And so there's, whether you're internal or external, there's just executive decisions get made that feel like they're for the betterment of the publisher, or that they're in line with where the industry is going right now, or whatever else it is, that sometimes just when you look back on it, you're going like, what in the heck were they thinking, right? But that's just sort of what often happens, right?
John Skull, to answer your question, again, if you created a comic book character or a series, oftentimes you may be listed as the creator, and you may not even still own the rights. All of it's going to be a case-by-case scenario. Usually, collectively, video games are team-driven. But I mean, you can also build into the deal in terms of that I always want to be known as the creator of the product, right? Like that. I mean, all that varies in every situation. But if being known as the creator, that's important to you, there are, that's something you can build into the deal. That's something that you can, to Troy's point, write a book about and talk about at another point. So.
But the harsh reality is, and the honest reality, I mean, to be blunt, is if you don't have if you're not a superstar, meaning, if you're not the Steven Spielberg, or you're not George Lucas, or you're not somebody who has a name and a reputation, even if you're, Greg Bear, who's a famous, if you don't know, famous like sci-fi book author, somebody, or trying to think of another, Tom Clancy, right? So if you're somebody who has an IP and has a name and a reputation in whatever industry that is, Todd McFarlane for toys, whatever that is, if you have that, then you can control a lot, right? But if you're just, even myself, even with my resume, even with my reputation, if I created an IP, which I've done many of, and I went to an EA and Microsoft and they said, hey, we love it, and I said, well, hey, will you fund it, and make this? If they said yes, whether I can retain the rights to that and the control of that, very, very unlikely. I mean, I can try and I can fight, but the reality is the people in the end with the money ultimately control pretty much everything. And that's the honest reality there, that you either have to have a name and a reputation to be able to step in and say, you can't do this without me because you need my name and reputation, or, you're just going to have to realize that until you have that, you really don't have a lot of leverage, because ideas to them are a dime a dozen, and there's 100 people behind you with other ideas. And if you're being difficult, they're just going to go take the next idea. Right. So that's the harsh reality, that it just takes some time. Now you might have more of a chance if you already are working at a game company and you're able to kind of, like maybe on the side, even put together your own game, put together a prototype, put together something and get it kind of together and have it already there. Then maybe you can go to a publisher and demand rights and keep your ownership and the IP and stuff. But again, if it's just purely, like you as a nobody, and this is your first thing and the first time you've done it, I would say that you've got a 1% chance at best at retaining rights ownerships. That's just their lawyers will beat you up, or they'll just walk away. So that's the harsh reality, to be blunt. I mean, it's hard. None of us want to hear that, but
it is complicated. Business of any kind is complicated. So.
Yeah,
that's part of the reason why we're doing this, is to help at least begin to get a high level understanding of what you're dealing with. Let's. I know that we're getting close to the stream's back end here. Why don't we talk about the influencers and then licensing? I think licensors actually be a really good one here.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand, where licensors fit into all the publishing side and even just in the design side, because as game designers, we often have to work with a lot of licensors or understand the complications of licensors. And so let's talk about licensors first, just because it's probably an easier topic, but or maybe not, but it'll take a little bit longer. Now, something to keep in mind of too that I want you guys to be aware of. There's one of the reasons that licensing in general is tricky, no matter what IP or whatever you're working on, is that on a legal side, licensing is really, really, really complicated, and that can come down to not just money but control. Like who has that ability to sign off on things, do things. So this is why when Ryan and I say like maybe avoid doing movies or things like that, for example, we're not joking. Like I've probably done as many or more movie-based IP games than anybody. I've done dozens of them, and none of them are the best experiences, in that, because when you have a movie license, that movie IP often is owned by a movie studio, but that movie studio might have actually licensed it. It might be Harry Potter, right? So they don't even own, like Warner Brothers doesn't own Harry Potter. The author of Harry Potter owns Harry Potter, and then they've licensed that to make their movies. The Lord of the Rings books are similar, where the book rights and the movie rights are actually different. And so the license gets really complicated because you're like, did I license the book or the movies? Because they're slightly different. And some characters exist in one and not in the other. And like which, you have to be very careful about which things you're doing, which stories you're following, which characters you have the rights to.
And to speak to that, like this is what happened with the Marvel IP. So in the 90s, Marvel was unraveling financially. So they're trying to get any kind of money they could. So they broke up and they gave, Sony Spider-Man, and they gave all these different groups different sections of characters. So now they try to come together and put when the Marvel universe is created, Spider-Man is sitting outside of it. It took a long time for Sony to come to deals with that because Spider-Man was outside. Sony had the Spider-Man rights. And so it can get very complicated very fast.
Yeah, and then to make it even worse is like, again, so you could have, movie and comics, like Marvel or whatever that are made into movies. And so there's maybe one right owner, but there could be multiple there. And then, like, let's say we're going to make a movie-based game. Like, for example, at EA, I worked on a bunch of James Bond games. Well, the actors, like the game I worked on had Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan had his own image rights and his own rights. And so so not only did I have to deal with the movie studios to deal with the James Bond license and the James Bond stuff and everything that went with Bond, and that was its own like nightmare, right? Then I also had the actual movie itself, and the movie itself had its own story, its own rights, its own things. The movie then had a director. The director had rights, and there was actually multiple people on the movie team
approval rights.
Had approval rights and things that they could do. Then it was required that I use Pierce Brosnan to star in the game because it was the game that he was there. Well, I had to go negotiate separate rights, which cost millions of dollars, and I had to get Pierce Brosnan also to approve and be in the game and to make a 3D model that looked like him. And then he had to do the voiceover work, which cost lots of money, and again, more approvals. And I mean, it just went on and on and on and on, and so, and then like the movie, like the music, like I was working on a particular project that Madonna did the theme song for the movie. And the movie paid her millions of dollars just for that theme song. And she came to us. We wanted to use that same theme song in our game to make it more authentic. And and this is like a $20 million game, and she wanted, I think, $2.5 million just for the theme song. And we were like, we're not going to give you $2.5 million for one piece of music. And that was what they thought, because that's what movies were paying them. So that's what they thought the games could pay them as well. And I'm like, I'm not paying you 10% of my budget for that one song. So every aspect, you have to be careful. Another story is Rainbow Six. Rainbow Six was a franchise, was originally a book that was written by Tom Clancy. If you know Tom Clancy, very famous, military book writer, and he's done tons and tons of movies, all the Jack Ryan, movies, things like that. So this was a book that he wrote called Rainbow Six. And then in that original book, he had a bunch of characters. Ding Chavez, people like that were the main characters.
They're such good books.
In the book. And hi, Rushback. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, what's up, Rush?
And so there's a case of, I was at Ubisoft. We had the rights to Rainbow Six, but then we thought, okay, there's the book. They hadn't made a movie on it yet, though we were trying, but it was just the book with all the characters. We thought, like, okay, that's pretty straightforward. Well, Tom Clancy went and got divorced. When he got divorced, for some brilliant reason, they split the rights of the stuff. So Tom himself owned the name Rainbow Six. His wife owned the names of all the characters. Don't ask me how those two rights got split, And so in the course of me making Rainbow Six Vegas, I could use the name Rainbow Six, but I could not use Ding Chavez. I could not use the main characters. So I had to invent all new characters because the previous characters were now owned by his wife, who didn't want to give us the rights. So just saying, like any kind of licensor stuff at all levels, just is a nightmare. And whether you're dealing with music, which Ryan can tell you a lot about from the music world, and I've also done a lot of, or whatever, it just gets complicated. And so just be aware of that's something that a publisher can help you navigate. They can help you negotiate, and they can help you manage those relationships there. But it definitely adds not just twice the complication, but sometimes 10x the complication between the relationships of all. It now becomes like a three-way relationship there. And so some of that can be complicated. In fact, one last story, I had one game that I worked on some years ago that was a really, really, really big IP. That IP was owned by a licensor, which was then licensed by a publisher who didn't want to do the publishing. So that publisher then went to another publisher and signed another deal, like a distribution deal, to go with this other much bigger publisher. And so I was in the developer. We just thought everything was going great, and we worked on the whole game. We actually made the finished game disc that still had the name of the really big publisher in it. Everything, we just thought that publisher was still working on it. We handed off the game disc to the smaller publisher. The smaller publisher rewrote the disc, took out the names of the big publisher, and never told us, not to the day we launched, that the relationship had severed between the two of them. And suddenly now, like, the small publisher published it and did a bad job doing it, and it became a nightmare. But like, they never even told us. And like, it was just ridiculous. Some of these situations you get in between licensors, license holders, publishers, and all these things, and half of it's politics and stuff. So you do have to be careful about stuff like that. Yeah, Friday the 13th had some messed up stuff in that as well. And yeah, again, they're just all over the board. And sometimes certain publishers are very unwilling to give approval rights sometimes for the games because they're kind of afraid of like getting in trouble. The people that are in the movie publishing side may not know a lot, or they're just afraid of like kind of approving it because they might.
Movie studios are totally risk adverse. Job risk adverse. They don't make any mistakes, so people are very reluctant.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, buddy. Thanks for coming in. Hope you enjoyed it.
And and I actually was on a project. I'm not mentioning names to save the guilty or to protect the guilty or whatever something. So apologize for being vague sometimes. But I worked on a very large movie based franchise game. That game got all the way completed. Like we were done with the game, and the publisher had not approved anything. Like not a single piece of art, not anything was approved yet. Because they just were like, no, we don't want to, like, we're afraid to approve everything and stuff like that. And I literally was very fortunate. This was one of the biggest movie studios out there. And because of my history, I used to work in movie visual effects. I happen to have some friends and know some people and just happen to know the CEO of that particular studio. And so I literally had to call him and say, like, dude, we're like, need to launch this game tomorrow. And if you guys don't sign off on it, like, we're screwed. We just lost $20 million, because you guys haven't approved anything, and we need to launch with your movie and all this kind of stuff. And he literally called a meeting with all the game publishing side of things, and it was a very awkward meeting. I'm sitting in there with all these top people from the publishing company. The CEO walked in and just went, "Whatever Troy says is approved," and he walked out, and that was the end of the meeting. They all looked at me and said, "Okay, it's approved." And that was how we got it done. It was just a total runaround, that we had to go to the CEO, at the movie studio if I hadn't had that contact, if I hadn't known that person, we literally would have lost $20 million because we would not have been able to launch that game. So it's just working with licensors and the relationships are really important. And so even just working with your publishers, long story short is all these relationships are really important. Building a strong relationship, whether you're working with a publisher or not, Ryan can talk about this a little bit. It can take you years to develop the trust and to develop the relationships with these publishers so that they will be interested in even talking to you once you're really truly ready to do them. So the need to network and the need to build the trust and the need to build the relationships with these publishers and to stay up to speed with them, for years is really important if you're a small developer.
Yeah, and back to the networking conversation, guys always treat people with respect. I think one of the easy things is for people to gossip or to slander, especially in gaming. People get frustrated or things get intense, and so people slander. Don't do it, because that will bite you in the bud somewhere along the way. Just telling you, as big as our industry is, it is very interconnected. And to Troy's point about doing a good job, and that's true, big. It's good in any industry, but especially in ours. Doing the best you can will carry on for your next project. And, you may build a relationship with a publisher. I actually was involved in a game where they pitched the game to us. I thought it was a great game. I liked the team. It was just outside of the budget that we had set for our created for our company. But I knew the guys, I trusted them, and so I handed it off to a publisher that I trusted. Right. And so that deal got done quickly because I built a rapport with the developer trusted me, and I trusted this other publisher. And so that handoff, it actually got that deal done quickly. And that saved them probably 6 to 9 months. And that studio they didn't have 6 to 9 months left in their bandwidth and their runway. So all those things can matter.
Yeah, because keep in mind, every publisher, Ryan can talk about this a little bit, but tell them about how each publisher tends to specialize. Not every publisher is great for every product, right? And talk about
Correct.
The slate and what a slate is within a publisher.
So let's just look at, if you take, I'll just look at us, for example. Our expertise is in FPS, horror, and strategy. And so we tend to focus in role playing. So we tend to focus on those 4 things. We don't move outside of that. So the slate of titles we're looking for, or another term would be a portfolio of products. We are trying to find products that we as a publisher understand. We understand how to market. We have relationships in those spaces. We have partners in those spaces that we know, or influencers that we know that fit in those spaces. So we look for those products. Another publisher may be looking for, retro games that new retro like Stardew Valley, or so a publisher's going to target what they know well. I think there's this thought, well, I have a game, I'll pitch it to this publisher, they have money. It doesn't really work that way. Almost every publisher has a specialization of the field that they are focusing on. I'm sure you could find, off the top of my head, I cannot think of an immediate example, but if you look at EA built itself off sports games, right? That's how they got their going. Activision really built themselves off of the shooter model. And so you look at, Square Enix did the JRPGs, right? Obviously there's places you can find where they branch out, but they tend to collectively focus on certain genres or certain types of games that they know well, because again, it's all about risk aversion. If I don't know this type of product and no one in our company knows this type of product, then it's a bigger risk for us. Whereas if you are a horror game and I publish horror games, then I'm going to be way more confident in my ability to evaluate and analyze your game for its potential success. Troy, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so to step back on this, what you need to understand is that every publisher has what's called a portfolio, or more commonly called their slate. Now, what that basically means is that that's not just their expertise in what they specialize in, but they literally have a release schedule that's generally 2 to 5 years out. And they will basically pencil in and they'll say like, okay, we have enough money, for example, or whatever it is. We might have 5 AAA games and 3 prototypes in development, or whatever their range. They may categorize them into certain things. And then within that, they might say that like, okay, we want 2 first-person shooters, 1 RPG, 1 horror game, blah blah blah, and they'll kind of dictate what their portfolio or their slate is, right? And then
and that's tied heavily to the release schedule. So like quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. So all those things factor in as well.
Yep, and so that's kind of how much money they're outlined, but they're also kind of guessing and they're staggering all these projects, so they don't want like 2 FPSs to land on top of each other, or they're cannibalizing each other, right? And so that's where it gets tricky. Like sometimes if one game needs to get delayed because it has problems, you may not be able to delay it, because if I delay it 6 months, it falls on top of something else that's going to crush it, and then it gets really tricky. And so, but the other problem when you're going out and pitching to a publisher is that the publisher has this slate. So you could have the best game idea ever, and the best team, the best company, the best everything, and go out to say pitch it to Microsoft and be like, dude, like you guys have to sign this, and they'd be like, yeah, you're right. Like this is an amazing product, but it doesn't fit our slate right now because we already have all of our slots filled and we don't have space. And that could be both in budget, the manpower, or whatever it else is that they need to manage that project correctly. And they'll turn down deals just because they just literally can't manage it. And they don't have the time budgets or whatever. By the way,
as a publisher, is the right thing to do. And I try to know you have too. There have been times where we have passed on a product that we know is going to be successful, right? But we already have a commitment to another development, another product, and that product is coming out in Q1 of 2021, and your game that you're pitching to me is going to come out Q1 2021, and they have a crossover space, right? And so, to Troy's point, I can't overlap those because it's going to cannibalize and potentially hurt both products. So that's a really good point, because the slate of games that are coming out also dictates what they're signing. And to your point too, even if they have infinite amount of money, the slate still drives what they're signing and when.
Yeah, when I was at Microsoft, if you guys don't know what headcount is, a lot of big companies control their growth by how many people they can have as full-time employees. And this at companies like Microsoft is everything. And so we struggled a lot because our FTEs or full-time employees as our headcount, we had to have a certain number of people, and it might have only been 5 or 10 that was our full-time, like our producers, our technical director, whatever, our people that were going to be working on this project dedicated 24/7, right? And we needed to have a certain number of that. And then we might be able to have a certain number of contractors or other outsourced companies or something filling in some gaps like for QA testing or things like that. But there's just a certain number of people. But we had this happen multiple times when I was at Microsoft where we literally just couldn't, like, they'd approve like an $80 million, I had a project, I had an $80 million budget approved. I mean, it was ridiculous. I had no headcount, 0 headcount. I could not hire a single full-time employee, but I had to have at least 5 full-time employees on site, on staff, as part of Microsoft to run this project. And it was the most bizarre thing. I'm like, I got $80 million. Can I fire somebody? They're like, nope, you have no slots to fill, in those things. It was insane. It killed the project. I was like, how do I get the budget approved, but I can't use it to hire people, and so some companies just have process like that can really mess with you. And so they do have reasons of why they're signing certain things and stuff like that. Another aside that's important to really understand about building this relationships and this networking, I would say that over the years, I've been in a number of small companies, and I would guess that about 50% of the projects that I've signed were signed not from the original idea that I had, but I went to a publisher, and sometimes I've known these guys for years, but I went to them with an idea and just like, hey guys, you want to look at this idea? And I'd go to them, I'd go talk to them, I'd show them an idea, and they're like, it's a good idea. We like it. Like the tech is solid. We like you guys. but we actually have an IP that we own, that we like, that we want to develop, and I'll fund that tomorrow. So how about you take your game, your technology, your team, and do this other game, and we'll pay you to do that. And at least half of the deals I've done came about because I built that relationship, but by constantly throwing more ideas at them, it kept me in front of them. It kept me in that relationship so that every 6 months or whatever, I was constantly at least in there, having some meeting with them and having something there in place. And that ultimately led to us signing a lot of other deals and other projects, and stuff. So keep in mind that if you're a small developer, if you're an indie or whatever, again, that relationship that you build with these guys, don't just go dark and only talk to them once every couple years or talk to them at the trade show once a year or whatever, but don't harass them either. But in the same hand, make sure you're touching base. Like if you're getting to a point where you got some bandwidth and your team's going to need something, like, say like, hey, what are you guys looking for right now? Or hey, what do you guys have? Or do you guys have something that you want made? Or can we pitch a new idea at you or whatever? But it's a two-way street. And quite often, if you need money and you need, you're not super picky, you can get, a really good deal developing something they've already got. You may not own it, you may not whatever, but money's money, right? And so don't be shy about asking about what else they might have.
Don't punch the gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah. And so part of the problem, like when I've worked with small developers, in the past, and one of the challenges is that if you rewind back to the beginning of my career, like we had a project that was literally like a couple pages of paper. We flew down to a publisher in LA. We showed them those 2 pieces of paper. We had some reputation, we had some stuff, but we had never done a project together as a team. But we literally, they wrote us a check, and signed a contract on the spot. Like we literally flew home with a check, and that was this amazing feeling. Fast forward a few months, we started working on the next game. And that one took us about 3 months to negotiate. Fast forward to the next game. That one took us about 6 months to negotiate. And the next one took us about a year to negotiate. So by the time, what was happening was the amount of time it took us to negotiate and get an idea, get it prototyped, get it built, and then go through legal, like talk to a bunch of publishers, go through that whole selling process, and then get through legal and get it all approved to a point where we can actually start a project, started to become longer than the development time of the next game. And so we quickly realized as a small developer, we weren't going to stay in business, because we literally couldn't sign deals fast enough in order to keep our team, going. And that was the problem as being a small developer. And so the importance of business development and working with publishers and keeping those relationships going, if you're a small developer that's going to be dependent on them financially, is everything, right? So you have to keep a perpetual ball rolling for the next project, and you have to keep some resources, whether it's part of your existing team or whether it's a small little core team that's working on the next thing or whatever. But you can't wait and like finish a game and then think about what's next. The publishing world and these cycles are just brutal when it comes to how long this process is going to take to negotiate. Sometimes you get lucky, but on average, it can take a long time. I don't know, Ryan, you might be able to talk about this a lot of just what you're seeing right now in the...
I consistently 6 to 9 months is realistic. A year, 9 to 12 months is not unheard of either.
Yeah.
Easily. And again, understand the back and forth. So let's just kind of talk through the process, right? I pitch to Troy, all right? Troy then takes that pitch. So usually your initial pitch is with one individual. It's kind of like I'll call them gatekeepers, right? Like gatekeeper 1 says, okay, yeah, this is cool. Let me take it to the team. So he goes up the ladder to his team. So maybe he's got in his publisher, he's got 4 or 5 guys in his division, and he says, hey, look, the Waller Game Studio pitched FPS 1. Look at this. Oh, wow, that's cool. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to them and say that we're interested. So then they'll come back to us, and maybe they'll ask some more questions, right, to get more clarification. These processes aren't next day. These are weeks, right? And so every time that you move up the ladder, so you start with like funding or investment, you're going into the CFOs, you're going to the executive CEO levels. those meeting schedules maybe once a month, right? And so the exchange of time that happens between these handoffs is easily 3 to 6 months, easily.
Yeah,
and then when you start talking about like actual then getting milestones and milestone payments, and then once it goes to legal, that's a whole other challenge. So it's easily 6 months.
And talk about due diligence, the diligence process that a publisher will do on you.
Yeah, and again, that'll also vary depending on the amount you're asking for, depending on the type of game. There's a lot of factors, right? If you're doing just a distribution deal, this game's done, and we need marketing, that's a way easier deal than I need $10 million.
Well, and so part of this, what we call the diligence side of things too, as a publisher, is this idea that they need to validate that you as a developer are legitimate and that you're capable of doing what you say you can do. Now, the more legitimate you are, meaning the more games you've signed, the more games you've shipped, the more success you've had, that diligence can go down to very small. But before a publisher is going to write you a $10 or $20 million check, they're going to be doing their diligence, and literally in some cases they physically come to your office. They'll be like checking that you got locks and security and the proper levels of stuff that that's going to protect their investment. Do you have servers? Do you have backup systems? I mean, like all the way down to like, who are your team members and are they legit? Like, have they done what they say they've done? Like, who's on this team? All the way down to like looking at your code, looking at your engine, looking at your technology.
Yeah.
All these kinds of things. All that stuff can just take months. And it can be a nightmare. And some publishers even want to see your bank accounts and your bank records and
like your personal.
Yes. Like, I mean,
not your team and not your business, your actual like, okay, Drawn Skull, Steven, we want to see the last 2-year tax returns and your last 6 months bank statements.
No, and they will ask for that sometimes. It's ridiculous how detailed and how deep some of these publishers will go.
Again, it does. The more money you're asking for, the more detailed that becomes.
Yeah, but that's why these deals can sometimes take a long time. And then don't forget, you're competing against 100 other companies or 1,000 other companies that are trying to do the exact same thing. And you got to prove that you're better than they are, and so on and so forth, right? You're not the only thing they're looking at, right? I still remember like one GDC not too long ago. I was hanging out with a friend who was head of biz dev for one of the big publishers, and this was right when PUBG came out and the whole battle royale genre, was hot, right? Everybody and their mother wanted to literally do a battle royale game. And he told me this was like day 3 of the conference. So he's 3 days into this conference. He had already looked at 42 pitches for Battle Royale games. 42 of them in 3 days he had already looked at. And that's just from one publisher and one business development guy in just in that one genre. I was like, oh my God, are you serious? He's like, yeah, like literally everybody's trying to do like Battle Royale right now. Like, and so that's the problem with our industry as well, is like as soon as one thing's hot, you may think like, hey, we're going to go do another Battle Royale game and like we got a cool idea. It's like, yeah, you and 100 other people, like, get in line,
Well, and I'll point out, like, if you guys get a chance, like, this can happen too, where you think you have this really original idea, right? And maybe you do, but most gaming evolutions come out of something previously, right? And so someone else may have that very similar idea, and then you're now competing with someone that you feel like, oh, well, they stole my idea. No, they didn't steal your idea. It's just that it's an idea that a lot of people have. I'm going to say is there was a game called Last Tide, which is a really cool spin on the Battle Royale by Digital Confectioners. And they ended up doing a premium Battle Royale as Battle Royale shifted to free-to-play. And so it caught them in a really bad spot. And it was a cool game with a lot of potential. But they were self-publishing, and they didn't get the money they needed to get to the market in time.
Well, and even within a single publisher sometimes, like, it's amazing because you get different studios and different groups. Back again when I was at Microsoft, we had a game called Voodoo Vince, which did come out for the original Xbox. And we had another game called Psychonauts, which ultimately got canceled, but originally was being published by Microsoft. And we had basically 2 games that when you read the design documents and you looked at the mechanics and all these things, they were almost identical. Like, I mean, they were like, and they were both supposed to come out the same day and like all this kind of stuff. And it was like, they weren't even like internally talking very well. You know, these different business development guys were signing things left and right, you know, and I'm like, oh my God, we ended up with 2 titles that were so close. And so like we were struggling, you know, to differentiate the whole time just to like pull them apart. And ultimately Psychonauts had a lot of trouble and we ended up canceling it, unfortunately, because it turned out to be a really great game. And
that's a great story, because essentially Microsoft dumped, I think, north of $20 million in that product, and they were able to walk away when Microsoft canned it, found a publishing deal for $1 million, and basically just got $20 million bucks in their pocket. It's and then it was a hit on top of that. So
yeah, if you guys don't know, one of the things that can sometimes work for you, it can kill your company as well. But if you're smart and you do the right deal on the legal side, if the publisher cancels your project, if you're smart, you actually get the right to, not only would you then get the rights to own everything that you had developed, so all the code, all the art, you know, the IP license rights and all that kind of stuff, but also quite often you don't have to pay that publisher back. So if they've put in $10 or $20 million, if they cancel it, it's on them, and they literally will have to okay, you got the money, free and clear. Occasionally I've seen deals where you have to pay them back if you end up publishing again. You know, occasionally maybe you still owe them that money, but 9 times out of 10 those deals were done in such a way that if they canceled on you, you got to keep that money. Now if you failed for some reason, then you might end up owing them the money, but generally you're not going to cancel the deal unless you're going out of business. So at that point, there's nothing really to owe because you're bankrupt. But that's
very few publishers are going to put into their deal terms that if they cancel this project, you owe them, because that essentially means they don't believe that they're going to get the product finished, which looks really bad. Like if my biz dev guy said, "Hey, or my publishing team said we're signing this game, but we're going to make sure that if we cancel this, they have to pay us back." Like, why are we going to cancel this?
Yeah.
Why are we going to sign a game they're going to cancel?
Yeah.
Like, that's even in your mind, even doubt of that there's no reason to sign this product.
Yeah. And
so to Troy's point, you could probably get that built in.
Yes. And so there has been a number of studios like Double Fine, Oddworld, other companies that have actually managed to get some pretty lucrative deals by working with the publisher. You know, they got into some trouble, they get canceled, but they've already now basically been given a lot of money. They got enough of a steamroll, enough reputation, whatever, that they go get another publisher and they finish it off. But now, you know, they basically got a significant portion of their budget paid for, which they no longer have to pay back. You know, and so now they get way more profit. And so a few studios have been very fortunate that has actually worked in their favor. But, you know, in the same hand, if you're only a few $100,000 in or $1 million in and whatever, and you get canceled, you may, you know, at that point, your company could be out of business too. So, you know, you got to be, you know, it's not something you want to hope for, but, you know, in a couple cases, it has worked for the publishers.
What it does come back to is just making sure that you are making smart negotiations and dealing with anybody in any business. But, you know, always try to protect yourself when you can.
Yep. Well, it looks like we're out of time.
Yeah. Any last questions before we wrap up? Guys, we appreciate you all joining us today. Troy, thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed being on the stream. I guess
thanks, Ryan.
Maybe we could follow up and do the last half of this another time.
Yep. No, it's definitely one of those big topics that, you know, we could probably put a whole course around, let alone
absolutely. We absolutely could.
A couple things. And, you know, next time I want to even bring Scott Bayless back on and have him also, because he's the master of all this stuff. We're still the students.
We're both from the Scott Bayless tree of coaching, kind of.
If you guys don't know, Scott Bayless is an old-time friend. He was one of my mentors and one, you know, just one of the greatest guys in the industry. He works with us at Forthright as well, and he now, as of this month, joined to help me out as a mentor at CG Spectrum as well. But just
he loves to teach. He loves to bestow knowledge.
Yes, and so I only know a fraction of what Scott knows when it comes to the world of publishing and and deals and terms. He's forgotten more than Ryan and I will ever know in a lifetime.
That's not exaggeration.
And so one of these days, well, Scott was on a few weeks ago and did give a talk, but we definitely have to have Scott back and have a similar conversation here, because he can definitely go 10x deeper than we'll ever be able to, on these types of things. So
any tips, John Skull? So Stephen, I would say, and I know I mentioned this to you before, I know you're really passionate, which is awesome. We need passionate people. I would just find one thing, complete one thing, right? Write that one design out, or the one document, or the one screenplay. Like, really focus on the one thing, and because it's easy, we get in entertainment and in media, there's so many places of interest that you could get distracted in, or be just generally trying to learn. But create an area that you complete something in, and then grow from that point. So really focus on one thing. Whatever you want to do that one thing well, and push everything else to the side until you get that thing focused. That's what I recommend. As a guy that's very passion driven myself, that's my own life experience talking. Troy and I both kind of started in one area and then grew our skill set out of that area. And so that would be my recommendation. Troy, what about you?
I mean, you can have the best idea in the world, but execution in the end is everything. And so it's hard. But if it's just you and it's just your passion, you're not going to have the ability to execute on making a full game or a full movie or whatever. And so figure out what you're good at. Figure out what you know, what you can do. Are you a writer? Are you a game designer? Or what is it that's there? And then how can you build something, whether that's could be a movie script, could be a TV script, could be a book, it could be a game design, or some combination thereof, but build that one thing and show why it's special, show why this is unique, show why it's there, and maybe try to enlist some friends to help you, show visually. If you're not good at art, how can you show how this thing's original? The more you can kind of show, the more you can get across there, and then try to find, somebody that believes in you. But it is hard when you're just an idea guy, right? Because everybody wants to be the idea guy, and so it's hard if you were to even take an idea. In fact, when I was at Microsoft or the big publishers, I was not legally even allowed to open emails or mail or anything from anybody I didn't know. Like, I literally had to reject it because there was a legal risk of them saying, like, well, I sent you an idea and then you copied it or something like that. It's like, so if you don't have a reputation, if you're not part of a real company, you're never going to be able to get a foot in the door somewhere. So somewhere, somehow, you've got to get somebody to believe in you, right? And so you've got to create something that's amazing, and then somehow you've got to network and get that to them in such a way that they're there. But start with a smaller company. Start with somebody that might be willing to work with you. Find a really good group online of, say, some engineers that don't have a good game designer, and say, like, look, I got an idea, you got the skills to do it, let's work together and let's build something, and get it out there. But if you have such huge aspirations that you're like, I'm going to make this thing and I'm going to go sell it to Sony,
I'll have the next Game of Thrones. Yeah,
whatever, the odds of that happening are just few and far between, and that's the harsh reality. Start small, and then figure out how to make that a small success, and then build and build and build, right? Even just your game idea. Like, you might have a game idea that's just massive, but see if you can make a small mobile game out of it first, right? Find something cheap and easy, make that a success, but make it part of a bigger IP that you can now do a sequel and then do something bigger, and, and eventually get to your dream. But if you start with your dream, you're going to have, potentially, if your dream's too big, you're going to have a higher chance of failure, right? So just be aware of that.
Yep.
So, but yes, we're all going to be busy for the rest of our lives, and that's my blessing and curse as well, is that, my creativity never stops, and, sometimes it's hard to sleep, and sometimes it's hard to do anything to even function, because you just want to be working on the next idea and the next idea. But that's the joys of being a creative, and that's why we do what we do, right? So,
yep.
Anyways,
I'll definitely come back. We have a lot more to cover, honestly, on this topic. So,
yeah.
Troy, thanks for having me today.
Yep,
Everybody, thanks
for
watching. If you're watching on the VOD or on YouTube, again, appreciate you all taking the time to watch this, and we look forward to giving you guys some more knowledge and information.
Yep, look forward to seeing you guys next week. So, all right, guys, thanks again.
What's up, Big Glove? That's right, buddy. we got some space squadrons coming up.
Yep.
I'll see you, brother.
All right. Take care, everybody, and be safe.
Have a good night.
Bye now.